This is an NBC News special report. Here is
Digital Herrera. Hi everyone. As you can probably tell by looking around, I'm not in today. While I'm sure you're all very excited about this, that does not mean the learning will stop. In fact, I've brought along my friend Digital Herrera to help guide the classroom today with the assistance of the sub. That Digital Herrera, he's crazy. So we do have a big day planned for you today. Big day, huge day. We're going to be talking about Shays Rebellion. So we're going to start with a quick video clip about that, and then we will go through the PowerPoint, which I've posted on Schoology. After that, you'll have time to work on your homework, which has also been posted on Schoology. So if you could please take out your ISN and open up to 8.2, and we will get started. I got you. You thought we were going to start class without any jokes. No way. All right, here we go. What time do astronauts eat? Launch time. Why does the clock in the cafeteria run slow? Because it always goes back for seconds. Think about it. 4 seconds. 4 seconds. Okay, yeah, you get it. All right, ready? Last one. How does the barber cut the moon's hair? Eclipse it. All right, enough fun and games. I'm going to turn it over to my very capable partner, Digital Herrera. Digital Herrera, take it away. Well, thanks a lot, Real Herrera. Like Real Herrera said, we do have a big day planned, so let's go ahead and get started. Since I am Digital Herrera, I figured I would employ the use of a good friend of mine, digital media. So let's start today's lesson by watching a quick video on Shays Rebellion.
All around him, Daniel Shays saw poor farmers like himself, many of whom he had served with in the Revolutionary War, now being sent to rot in debtors' prisons. Families were left without providers, and mothers were forced to beg in the streets.
He had been taken to court for debts twice by different retailers. So Daniel Shays was afraid that he was going to lose his land, he was going to lose his crops, lose his cows, and so on, and he couldn't support his family at that point.
To lose your farm and to have to work for someone else was more than just an economic decline. It was a decline in your status in your country. That is, you would no longer be a voter. In order to vote in most colonies and in most states, you had to prove that you owned land. This made you an independent man.
And here you have an interesting situation of the complete insensitivity, the blindness of a political elite. The political elite that governed Massachusetts were for the most part centered in eastern Massachusetts. They were oriented towards the sea, towards commerce, towards business. And indeed, there was a wide cultural, economic, and geographic gap between eastern Massachusetts and the western part of the colony.
Shays began to meet frequently with his supporters at Conkey's Tavern, inciting them with talk of self-government and rebellion.
It had been a tradition for decades and decades, maybe centuries, to have demonstrations by the people when they felt that there was some economic inequity or some invasion of people's rights as citizens by people in power. Shays' Rebellion, in a sense, comes out of that tradition.
Shays had convinced his fellow farmers that something had to change. During the summer of 1786, all over western Massachusetts, conventions were held to determine a list of demands that were to be delivered to state government leaders in Boston. Because Boston was both the center of industry and also the major port, the state government was largely composed of wealthy lawyers, merchants, and property owners.
The Eastern establishment turned a deaf ear. There were protests, The rebellion that erupts in 1786 and 87 did not come as a great surprise. There had been lots of little bits of evidence and suggestions that the people in the West were unhappy. But the Eastern establishment ignored that, and they went ahead with their program of taxation. That is, taxation to raise the money, to pay the state debt, and to make the necessary contributions to national government. In the meantime, ignoring this rising chorus that was coming up from the more rural areas of Massachusetts.
As a prominent figure in the Eastern establishment, Samuel Adams had vowed to stay out of politics after the Revolution. But the temptation was too much, and he eventually ran for state senate. He won, and was soon elected Senate President. One of his first acts was to call for an end to the county conventions.
County conventions are not only useless, but dangerous. They served an excellent purpose and were highly necessary when they were set up. But no more!
The irony of Samuel Adams's career after the American Revolution is that the very techniques that he pioneered, the very strategies that he developed, the very tactics that he employed were now going to be used by, one might almost say, his students. His students being now the farmers in western and central Massachusetts. They began to organize in meetings of protest, in county conventions, in town meetings, in all kinds of activities that mirrored exactly what Samuel Adams had been doing in the 1770s. The difference now is that Samuel Adams, the great agitator of the 1770s, the great organizer of resistance, now in the 1780s, looks upon these people in resistance and is horrified. Absolutely horrified.
It can never be the duty of one man to be concerned in more than one revolution.
But Daniel Shays and the farmers of western Massachusetts didn't agree. They were indeed concerning themselves with a second rebellion. They had tried the way of conventions, petitions, and letters to their elected leaders. They had tried to seek justice legally, and they had been ignored.
They viewed lawyers and they viewed judges in the same way as they viewed the Eastern politicians. These were men out to suck their blood.
Shays still had no way to pay his debts to the businessmen of eastern Massachusetts, and was faced with the threat of imprisonment, crushing poverty, and the loss of his farm. To feed his family, he had been forced to sell his most cherished belonging, the sword he had received from the Marquis de Lafayette. Fortunately, Daniel Shays still had one sword left, the cutlass he had carried in the Battle of Bunker Hill. And now he sharpened it again in preparation for a new battle. In the late fall of 1786, Daniel Shays began to muster and train an army. Among them were many of the men he had fought with in the Revolution.
The Massachusetts veterans of the Revolution who joined Shays' Rebellion put the hemlock in their hat when they went off to war to fight against British tyranny. I mean, it was symbolic. This is the new tyranny that they're fighting against.
The poor and oppressed of Massachusetts had desperately needed a leader. Now they had one, Daniel Shays.
Well, I hope you liked the video. It clears things up for you. If it didn't, we're going to go through the PowerPoint that talks about Shays' Rebellion. I have posted the PowerPoint on Schoology, so feel free to open that up if you'd like and follow along. If not, follow along in your ISN, and here we go. No respect is paid to the federal authority. It is not possible that a government can last long under these circumstances. James Madison. James Madison said this soon after the Shays' Rebellion. It had become clear to him that the government, the way that it was set up, would not last long. He knew that the states had acquired too much power, and the central government didn't have enough. So after today's lesson, you should be able to answer two questions. Why did Shays' Rebellion lead to change? And based on Shays' Rebellion, what needed to change? Shays' Rebellion and the need for change. So as we look at this picture, we see a couple of things. We see some folks sitting around on some right outside a building. It was made of brick, sitting on some stairs. These don't look like very official men, but you do see that they're holding rifles, and they are kind of looking in one direction. And I think from this picture, we can assume that based on their clothing, that maybe they are farmers, and maybe they're looking at Daniel Shay or uh, someone else who is agreeing with Daniel Shay, who's trying to motivate the men to take up arms against the government because of the treatment that they've received from the government. So the paper money that was printed by Congress during the Revolutionary War was almost worthless. While Congress did have the power to mint coins, mint means make coins, they didn't have enough gold or silver in reserve to be able to back up the value that the government was saying that the money was worth. So the states began printing their own money. However, the states' money had little value. Although the value of the dollar had been decreased because of the government's inability to support it with gold or silver, they still were paying the soldiers with that money. The money shortage hurt the farmers the most because many of the farmers fought for the colonies at the time, later becoming the United States, during the Revolutionary War. They had to leave their farms behind and fought valiantly for the United States, but when they returned after the war, they were given money that was worth almost nothing. So not only did they not have crops that they could sell to the market, they didn't actually have any money. Well, what happens when you don't have any money? Your house gets foreclosed on. That means that the bank is going to take it away. In this case, Massachusetts judges ordered farmers to sell their land and livestock. It was the judges that were going to take away the land because the debtors had taken the farmers to court, and the courts found that the farmers didn't have the money to pay the debt. So they said, okay, we're going to take your land and livestock away. You have nothing to say about this because you don't have any actual money to pay the debtors, the people who the farmers needed to pay back. Well, Daniel Shay, who was a prominent soldier in the Revolutionary War, says, no way, we are not going to allow this to happen. So he gets a bunch of his good wartime buddies and he heads down to the courthouse because he figures if we shut down the courthouse where the judges work, then the judges can't order our farms to be sold, and as a result of that, we never have to sell any of our farms because we'll just shut down the courthouses. That would be like if you had a big test coming up and you came to school super early and you put locks on all the doors so that nobody could get in the school and you'd never have to take the test. Of course, that's short-sighted. They'll end up cutting all the locks off, and eventually you'll have to take that test. So it's not really a long-term solution. The point that Daniel Shay was really trying to make here was the injustice that he and his fellow soldiers had experienced, and he was trying to right the wrongs and just get back what he thought that they were owed. After successfully taking over the courthouse, Daniel Shay and his followers decided that they were going to need more firepower. So what they did is they said, hey, there's an arsenal in Springfield, Massachusetts, not Illinois. Let's go ahead and head over there. An arsenal is a place where weapons and ammunition are stored. So what a great idea, right? You take your good buddies who are looking to shut down the government and shut down the courthouses and show the wrongs that have been put upon you by the very government that you fought for. Let's head to the arsenal. We can grab a bunch of guns, grab a bunch of gunpowder and all that stuff, and then we'll really be able to send our message to the central government. So they head to Massachusetts, or to Springfield, so that they can arm themselves. Well, the government would have stopped this from happening. However, as we learned yesterday, there was no Continental Army because the Articles of Confederation did away with an army because they were afraid an army would be too powerful and might overstep their bounds and tread on the rights of individuals. But because no one is able to stop them, but because there was no Continental Army, there was no one around to stop them. Finally, militia troops from eastern Massachusetts are called in. The eastern Massachusetts is more of the populated areas, Boston and that area, were called in to stop the farmers and stop Daniel Shay and his crew from continuing to rebel. The rebellion clearly shows a lack of respect for the federal government here. But it also illustrates that there are some major problems. If the men who were just a few years earlier willing to fight and die to separate themselves from a government that they saw as tyrannical in King George, what were they doing now, fighting against a government that they again saw as tyrannical? And why would they do that? Well, it was clear to many of the founding fathers that the government was broken, and the concept of creating the opposite government from what you had with King George was simply not the right answer. You needed to have a lot more detail. It needed to have a lot more historical reference. It needed to take into account much more than just doing the opposite of what they knew before. So like I was alluding to, this calls for a convention. Shays' Rebellion, one of the biggest parts of Shays' Rebellion is not necessarily shutting down the courthouses or the storming of the Springfield Arsenal. It was really how much it showed a need to change the Articles of Confederation. So a convention was called to revise the Articles of Confederation. This is really important. The Constitutional Convention, as we know it today, was not called to create a new constitution. It was to revise the Articles of Confederation. It just so happened that when they got there, they realized that it was broken far beyond repair. At any rate, this convention was held in Philadelphia in May of 1787. James Madison had been studying governments past and present, had been studying Greek democracy and the Roman republics, and had studied the Magna Carta, and more about that in another lesson. But he had been studying, he had mountains full of ISNs, full of historical information about past governments that had been successful as well as governments that had been terrible failures. Through his studying, Madison determined that when you have a government that is made up of a bunch of parts, there needs to be a strong central government. That doesn't mean that you need to have a king, but it does mean that you need to have a group of people, like I have said before in previous classes, you need to have a referee. You need to have a Congress that can make laws. You need to have an executive branch and have somebody who can make quick decisions when they need to. You need to have a national Supreme Court or a federal Supreme Court. These things were clear to Madison. What was not necessarily clear to Madison and the rest of the Founding Fathers was exactly what that would look like in practice. So again, we look at James Madison's quote, "No respect is paid to the federal authority. It is not possible that a government can last long under these circumstances." Take a minute to look at these two questions. Go ahead and answer these two questions in your groups, and then we can share out as a class in a couple of minutes about your thoughts on these two questions. Okay. Well, that's all I have for you today. Thanks a lot for paying attention, which I know you do because I was watching you from the overhead projector where I live. So now you have some time to get started on your homework, which is to read 1.3 and fill out the ISN page. You'll have the rest of the class to work on that, and that will be due tomorrow. So, regular Herrera back tomorrow, and he will see you then. All right, have a great afternoon. Now get to work.